ACC stability, at least for a little while. Could we have the right answer to the fake injury problem and combine troubles for a Buckeye quarterback? This is the College Game Day Podcast. We are recording first week in March. We'll drop it soon. Rece Davis and Pete Thamel here. We anticipate being joined by Field Yates for a little combine talk later on. But first, the conference battles, particularly the internal battles within the ACC after plenty of posturing and blustering and backroom whispers when filing lawsuit briefings threatened to become the next ACC championship event, a ceasefire and new revenue sharing model coming to the Atlantic Coast Conference that we believe will bring peace at least for 5-6 years. Pete, you've been in the middle of all of this. This seems to be quite the win for Jim Phillips in the ACC. It seems to be a bit of a win for Florida State and Clemson, which will not have to share evenly all of the revenue. And I would even say it's probably a win for some of the programs that were deemed coveted by conferences on the outside and potential linchpins to any type of, future realignment, meaning most notably North Carolina and Virginia, who in their heart of hearts, I believe, they want to stay in a stable and productive and economically healthy ACC, and it appears that they will be able to do that based on the settlements that are coming. Is that all pretty? It's pretty surface level, but all pretty accurate.
Yeah, I think so, Rece. I think that this all kind of started with Florida State's ready, fire, aim overreaction to not making the playoff. If you really remember the timeline of all this happened, it was almost like a diversion to that heartbreak. These complicated legal things tend to get crystallized into one quote. Trustee Drew Weatherford's quote is the one that resonates. It's not a matter of if we leave the ACC, but how and when we leave. Well, the how and the when, there's at least clarity to it. I think that was a key word kind of in talking to people from all sides on Monday. This now gives clarity to how ACC schools will make money. And down the road, especially when things get hot again around 29-30, and we can talk about that, Rece, because that really becomes a nexus point for the next great reverberations in college football. But the news here is pretty simple. There's a new distribution method for the ACC. They take 100% of the media money, 40% of it gets divided. I've been joking by communism, right? By the old method. The original. I believe it's the original 14 before the legacy members might be the best thing. It all gets chopped up evenly like it has been. Everybody eats at the same trough for 40% of that money. The other 60%, bust out your calculators, is a formula. Nobody quite is talking about the fine point details of the formula, but it's essentially based on the last 5 years of football viewership. So my understanding is it'll be like the prior 4 years, and then this year coming up added on, and then they'll do the payouts that way. So this is going to start in the upcoming fiscal year this summer. That's obviously going to favor Clemson. It's obviously going to favor Florida State. It's likely going to favor Miami and North Carolina. I've been told the plus side of that, those who favor well in this formula, and there'd still be one more year to play to do the math in, could make upwards of $15 million extra, maybe even 20 for those lagging on this formula. We're going to assume that that's the Wake Forest, although they did have a pretty good run the last 5 years in terms of higher profile games. Your Syracuse, Boston College, Virginia, Duke football, they are going to lose money. The money that they had thought was going to be coming that way are going to be taken away. Georgia Tech, oddly, Rece, was the most watched team last year, thanks to a Dublin beautiful suffocation of Florida State, taking their out of the ball, and then was it 7 overtimes against Georgia? Eight overtimes. 8 overtimes. Ring that slot machine.
And on Friday night, Pete, if you'll recall, where there, not a lot of opposition, not that people wouldn't watch a Georgia 8 overtime game against Georgia Tech anyway, but you put it on Friday night of rivalry week and everybody's watching it.
Oh yeah,
throw in a game against Notre Dame.
Playoff stakes too.
Yeah. Throw in a game against Notre Dame in the middle of the season, and how about the Yellow Jackets, a rambling wreck from Georgia Tech, and a hell of a ratings grabber.
It's so I was told the most those teams are going to end up losing every year is about 7 to 8 million. So the upside is 15, maybe even up to 20 for the big brands. The downside for the smaller brands is that. And this is basically a creative yet uneasy truce that's going to get the league likely through the next 5 years or so. And I do think it's a little bit of a snapshot of the future, Rece, and what things could end up looking like. These leagues for years, remember the Big 12 was the example of this, right? You have uneven revenue sharing, and the leagues don't last, right? Well, I just think the world is so big now, and these leagues are so big now, and everybody's got side deals and cut deals. If you look at the Big 10 and you look at the ACC, I do think this could end up being a harbinger for how money is divided in the future. Now, I'm not saying they're going to follow that plan, but the notion for the next generation of metaphorical Vanderbilt getting as much as metaphorical Georgia just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Remember, money's always been important in college sports, Rece, but now with having to pay the players, which they never really had to do before, at least directly, is going to create a whole new series of financial pressure. So I don't think you can overstate what a big day this is for the ACC. They had a year and a third of a giant headache, self-induced by Florida State and Clemson, and they have found a creative way to put the guns down and move forward for a period of peace. Now, if you remember, the Florida State lawsuit estimated it would cost $500 million to leave. Now, some of that was trumped up because they were trying to say the buyout was not legal, and
exorbitant, unfair, and
all that. They used all the big words, right? And the reality is there was a risk for Florida State or Clemson to cut that. I mean, that's a massive check. We talk about funny money all the time at buyouts. That's a massive check. There was a risk to do that. A, because there was no guaranteed league on the other side, especially for Florida State. And B, the whole darn thing might change by 2030, Rece. Right? Yeah. There is now. I spent a lot of time talking to people about this. Nobody can quite say who or why or how. There's just unrest in so many places, and the model is so tenuous right now, and they so badly need Congress to help codify some things to give a little bit of stability. I mean, we're all waiting on a judge's hearing in early April. I believe the day of the title game, Rece, will be in San Antonio, that allows the economic model for next year to come. So a random federal judge in Northern California holds the fate of an entire $1 billion enterprise in her hand. It's a pretty remarkable just spot they're in. So last thing from the news standpoint, there is now clarity on the buyout. It's a declining number. I've been told if anyone is to exit the league by 2030, which is the first time they could really go to then join a league, the Big Ten, which has a contract coming up, the cost would be under $100 million, and that's significantly less. So everyone can claim victory here, Rece, a little bit. Florida State and Clemson got the clarity and the number down. The ACC has a period of peace to push forward, and there's financial victory clearly for those that the eyeballs are on.
And all of it comes up basically at the same time. ESPN's deal with the college football playoff runs through 31-32, the new deal that is starting after this season. Big 10, Big 12 also have media deals coming up at about that time. And the question is begged in some quarters, well, okay, why would the schools that you mentioned earlier, BC, Syracuse, Wake Forest, agree to this? It's because otherwise that they may be left out. They may be hung out to dry. And we've talked to some people with some of those schools in the ACC that maybe don't have the richest football tradition, but even those administrations understand that they have to invest in football in order to keep maybe the basketball program or whatever that they value in position to be as viable and as strong and as prominent as it has always been. So it's a really fascinating time. Every time I hear people say that they need Congress to, codify things to do it, I cringe, because these are grown people with extensive acumen and expertise. And what they really need to do is negotiate. Now, I've said that I sound like a broken record on this. The biggest problem with negotiation is who's negotiating on the side of the schools and conferences, and who's negotiating on behalf of the players. Because I don't think that the conferences in football particularly want to hand this to the NCAA. So that means there's not really an entity unless you somehow hand it to the college football playoff to do it for football. And then there's certainly no designated entity on behalf of the players, at this point in time, to negotiate on their behalf. Negotiation's the way to do it. And I understand that, even unions and business leaders and laborers, they have frameworks that are defined by Congress and by, laws, various places. And one of the things that you hear administrators complain about in college is that, well, the laws in Tennessee are different, from the laws in California or whatever the two state examples might be. So I understand that part of it, but it also rings to me a little bit of somebody come fix this for us. And I'm of the opinion that they need to come fix it themselves. And they need to find a way to have entities empowered on both sides to negotiate and come to a collective bargaining agreement with the players. That will also help them with their transfer portal issue. I won't call it a problem, because it's not necessarily a problem. Can be if you're losing players you don't want to lose, or it can be if you're paying players you'd rather not play. Heard a story recently of a player, I'm not going to say in which sport or which school, who one of their NIL people said, this guy came and asked us for $750,000. Can you believe that? What an outrage. And he said, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, and that person he told the story to said, well, what would you do if I came to your house and said, I want you to give me $750,000? And he said, I would tell you to go do something anatomically impossible to yourself. And he said, well, why don't you do that? And they're afraid to do that. So, everybody's complaining, about, well, we've got to pay too much. This guy's not worth that, but I've got to pay it to keep so-and-so from getting him. All of these things, nothing would be perfect, but all of these things would be alleviated to some extent. And it's the only path I see. I'm certainly no business expert. I'm certainly no legal expert, but common sense tells you that this is really the only path forward. The problem is defining who the participants are in terms of who does the negotiating. But the whole, somebody please make me a law so that we know what to do. I just, I don't know. It doesn't strike me as being the right tone for this.
Let's play a game, Rece.
Okay.
What do you think college football looks like in 2030? What do you think the paradigm from within the sport exists? I guess that would be 6 seasons from now.
Yeah. In 30, based on the news that you and others have worked to break here for us, an excellent job on that, by the way, and the contracts that are coming up, I would say on that timeline, I'm not trying to split hairs or dive into minutia here. I would say around that time, it's going to look largely the same as it does right now.
Interesting.
But you throw it 3 years past that, like 2033, after this next round of contracts. Once it gets there. And I suspect, unless there's some type of massive change, you will have super leagues, as if you don't already. You will have some of the wheat separated from the chaff within those leagues. Some of the schools that traditionally don't pull their weight, whether competitively or by television ratings or whatever, will be at risk of being cut out. You will have a smaller, highest tier of college football. I would say it would probably be under 100 teams. Don't know what the exact number would be, but significantly under 100, I would guess. And I think the other thing that will happen is that, even though I know that there are some upset with me, and I do not care even a little bit that they think They don't like the fact that I don't like the automatic bid things for conferences, but that's probably coming. So it will look very much like an NFL playoff structure. And because of that, you will be able to play many more non-conference big-time games. You'll play more conference games. You'll play more big-time non-conference games, because all that really will matter in the long run is finishing in the top whatever of your conference, top 4 or whatever, and you'll have a smaller group of teams vying for those spots. That's what I think. I don't know that I think it's good, and I'm not advocating for it. That's just what I suspect based on the direction of the sport.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think once we get to 29-30, it will be really interesting, Rece. I think the playoff then comes up in 31. It's a 6-year deal.
That's right.
I think then we start to see. So for years, it even became like a little bit of a running joke in the industry. It was like, the streamers are coming, the streamers are coming, the streamers are coming. And it was
here now, boy.
Oh yeah. Now, but for a while they were like a stalking horse, right? Like they'll go to Netflix, and the poor Pac-12, everything timed out poorly for them. Like I think, a few years from now, it would be pretty normal for that. And the streamers are, I'm talking about Apple. I'm talking about Netflix. I'm talking about
Amazon Prime. Which Amazon Prime's they're in the NFL business.
No,
already.
That's what I mean. Like, we got Peacock showing NFL playoff games. We got our friend Kirk doing the Thursday games on Amazon. We have Netflix now, right in the thicket of things. And so here's the thing: the Pac-12, the newly configured Pac-12, isn't going to get like a monster streaming deal, because that is not going to lead to subscriptions. People aren't going to be like, oh, I'm going to pay $10.99 a month to watch Fresno and San Diego State. But there is content through these big brands and these big leagues that would have the streamers come in. And I really feel like right around when you have the Big Ten come up, remember Kevin Warren flirted with Amazon a bunch of times for a slice of that Big Ten deal. And before Washington and Oregon came to the Big Ten, there was chatter that they were trying to capture them, and part of that money would have gone to there. But I just think if you're looking at streamers as a factor in college football, that's when they're really going to come in. And now I think it's still a little novel to flip to Amazon. It's less, right? 2 years ago, I remember Kirk saying this the other day. People were like, wait, how do you do it? Now last year, they're like, oh, okay. And look, give them credit. The product is really good. Like once you go to the service, it's fantastic. So it will be interesting as that gets normalized, do they tap into the tribal passion of college sports, and do streamers come and enter the fray here? Because they can deliver a financial freight, when you look at the size of their market caps. That's pretty rare.
Hey, that really brings up something I think is maybe even as interesting as anything we've talked about so far. How many streaming services do you have?
Oh, like a lot.
Are you aware of all of them? Have you ever considered taking one of those apps and having it go through
I'd be embarrassed.
and going through and saying, "Hey, I'm paying for this." I've got. I don't know how many I have. I still have the cable box, like just in case. I never ever use it, and I keep wanting to, say I'm going to take this back to them and just use the Wi-Fi. I'm like, yeah, but what if the streaming service locks up? And then I had YouTube TV, which I have, one of the ones I have, and they're threatening not to have tournament games. I think maybe that's been resolved. I'm not sure. I think
that has been resolved.
But at the time they were thinking, so I'm like, well, okay, now I sure can't, because I have to be able to watch, to watch the tournament games. So I've got this idea. What if somebody could maybe consolidate all of the streaming services, and you just use like one device to go to and you had, you mean like cable? We're going to go all the way back to the circle.
Oh yeah, no,
we're going to pay one bill again someday.
Yeah, it's
maybe I don't know.
It's happening. I don't want to use that app that tells you how many subs you have. It's like I don't want to get a body fat counter. Like I'm too embarrassed to know the answer.
You don't want to know. There's some things you don't need to know the answer to.
I just want my YouTube TV to work in the NCAA tournament because I'm going to be home the first weekend. How did we ever watch the NCAA tournament without the 4 box?
I don't know.
That's really it's like mind-boggling that existed. And really, Saturdays when we get home from game day, if we don't stay for the game. Can you imagine watching Saturday night without a 4 box? That's my biggest problem, sports consumer, with the streamers. Like there was a great, I think it was Michigan State Purdue basketball game the other night. It was on Peacock, right? And might have been Michigan State Purdue. It was Purdue and somebody. And I had 4 box up.
It was Friday. Was that Friday? The Friday night game? That
might have been the Friday night game, but it was the week before. Yeah, there was. You can't put the Peacock in the 4 box. Right. And it's a huge problem. There's been some good games on Peacock in football, and it's like it's either the star of the show or that. I wonder if in ratings, if you're watching the 4 box, if they count all 4.
That I don't know the answer to. We need to get a in-depth investigative reporter on that to find out if the 4 box, if all of the ratings get counted. Because
or just the one you're listening to.
Right. Just last night, then that means that the North Texas game and the Jackson State game got a pretty good bump from me last night because Kansas and Houston were in the 4 box. Last thing before we bring in Field Yates, I was having a conversation. We had friends that were in the area in for dinner the other night. A couple friends, parents of some of my son's former teammates at Princeton. Oh, nice. And as it turns out, the mom is a former gymnast at Alabama, and we were actually in school together at the same time, but didn't know each other then. Anyway, she was talking about, she's a lawyer, and both she and her husband are lawyers, and she was talking about finding errors when you would ask AI. She's played around with AI. She'll find errors and things, whatever it might be. So then last night, I can't remember. Oh, you know what it was? I was looking up to see when the last time, I knew there'd been a long streak, but I was pretty sure they had broken it when the last time Duke had won the outright regular season ACC championship. And it was in 22, Coach K's last year. But within the AI answer to this, it said, and they confirmed their title by beating North Carolina in the final game. And I'm like, here we go. Here's another example. So people, do your own research. AI is not infallible. Reporters like Pete Thamel, infallible. Reporters and draft experts like Field Yates, infallible. And that's who joins us now, as Field Yates is here to talk a little NFL Draft Combine and a couple of other things first. And one of the infallible, intrepid reporters, draft experts, Field Yates, as teased, is here now. Field, what is your position on AI? I'm not talking about the unethical type things where we would use it to write scripts. I would never engage in that. But it's, if you need to look up a word, a historical thing, when's the last time such and such was drafted? Where do you stand on AI? And I was just sharing with Pete, I found an AI mistake last night, and I was jubilant that I knew it was wrong.
Maybe I'm old school, but I'm not much of an AI user myself.
Good for you.
I don't know the exact origins of why that's the case. I don't know why I have not yet reached what I view in some ways as the dark side. I'm a little fearful of it, though. Is there going to be a draft analyst who's simply an AI brain 20 years from now who can tell you that some, tradesy Texas A&M defensive lineman is going to go 3rd overall to the Jacksonville Jaguars? So I'm going to push back on AI for as long as I possibly can, or at least until my kids are through college. After college, maybe we can have a different conversation.
Is that tradesy D lineman going to my Jags is named Mason Graham? I hope. Yeah. I would like that.
I tell you what, Mason may have had something that by surprise could end up being like a benefit to the teams that are maybe picking somewhere in like the 4 to 8 range. As Mason Graham showed up to the combine at 296 pounds. Michigan listed him at 320 pounds this past year on the roster. And you say to yourself, 24 pounds, like that's a fairly large variance. And typically the smaller defensive linemen are going to want to have a few more pounds on their side on a listed roster. But 25 is a fairly sizable gap. That being said, I was talking to somebody from the Michigan program out there. He did note that he was a lot closer to 320 when we were playing than he was 296 pounds. I think maybe that was one of those classic cases of a guy who was sort of training for the combine as opposed to training to play football. the irony, I suppose, is that Mason Graham opted against working out. But we're now about 50 days away from the draft.
Did anybody work out?
Basically, yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, they actually at one point asked Pete and I to go out there with the receivers, Rece. We rebuffed such requests. But Mason's going to be one of those guys that you're going to hear some overthinking over the next 50 days. Are the arms long enough? Is he big enough? Is he disruptive enough? And I'm just going to laugh all the way until April 24th when he gets drafted and then goes on to a stellar career because he feels like he's on the short list of can't miss prospects in this year's class.
Do you like this draft class when you look at it holistically? You spend a lot of time digging in on it. Last year's was so glitzy, right? So many historically glitzy with the quarterbacks available. This year there probably isn't as much sizzle. There's some intrigue, but maybe not as much sizzle. Just what's your holistic view of this thing now that you've had your hands on it through a few different camps and combines and such?
Yeah, we have this reality that hits us around the Super Bowl is that every year, listen, if Saquon Barkley had run for 300 yards in the Super Bowl, and that's how the Eagles won, we'd be saying to ourselves, hey, all you got to do is find the best player on the planet and you're good. But then you think about some of the players that actually had pivotal moments in the Super Bowl, and they're players like Josh Sweat and Milton Williams along the defensive line from Philadelphia, and even Cooper DeJean, who was a second-round pick last year, and you're reminded that so much of the draft goes well beyond just the first 10 picks, even if the vast majority of our attention over the next 50 or so days is paid towards players that probably will go in the first 10 selections. So I think there are a lot of guys who maybe if the ceiling is lower relative to what the ceiling for a Malik Neighbors or a Marvin Harrison Jr. or a Brock Bowers or any of the quarterbacks that were taken last year, guys that are going to impact winning are really going to be, to me, the story of this year's draft. I have my top 32 dropping on Friday. It's updated, I would say, every month or so for ESPN.com, but it felt fitting to do so after the combine when you have this significant piece of the puzzle now baked into the evaluation. And what I realized is that the debates that I could have from player, 17, 18, 19, go all the way down to like 33 and 34. I'm not sitting here to tell you that I know definitively the player that just missed the top 32 cut in a different week or a different time of the calendar couldn't have been the 20th best player on the board. So I think it serves teams that are in the playoffs or were in the playoffs last year very well. There's going to be a lot of quality starters, even if there aren't as many transcendent players in this year's class.
Tease us with one riser, one guy in Indy who jumped up on your board. I don't want to give away your fine work, but just give us a little appetizer.
Yeah, the reality of the combine is that it's geared towards players who are athletic outliers in a positive way. So the most obvious name that I think come to mind on defense, it's Shedeur Stewart from Texas A&M, who I don't know how much more he could rise up the board. And truthfully, I'll end up probably being a little bit lower than consensus on Shedeur Stewart for these reasons. 4.5 career sacks, which I know you guys both know, and probably some of your audience knows as well. 1.5 sacks in each of his 3 seasons. 1.5, not 15, in each of his 3 seasons for a player who is going to be paid and drafted to rush the passer at the NFL level, where the tackles are only bigger, stronger, and faster, and the quarterbacks are only that much more nimble and athletic to elude pressure. So it's a big leap of faith from somebody. That being said, 264 pounds. He ran a 4.640, had some of the best vertical leaps. I had one of the best vertical leaps and one of the best broad jumps amongst any defensive player in the front 7. At the combine, I remember back in my early scouting days, we'd always talk about this. Bill Belichick had this golden rule of scouting, which is that we draft traits, we don't draft production. What he meant by that is not that you're going to ignore if a guy has 12 sacks. If he had 12 sacks like Abdul Carter did, probably means you had some pretty darn good traits too, right? But you couldn't be enamored exclusively with the production because there were guys who sometimes, whether it was scheme, whether it was injury they were playing through, whatever it might have been, could be the reason why the production wasn't that great. Most notable example I think of for the early Patriots was Richard Seymour, who incidentally had 1.5 sacks, just like Shedeur Stewart in his final college season. Pete, you probably remember this, living in the area at the time. The Patriots got raked over the coals. Every newspaper in Boston, when they took Richard Seymour over Corin Robinson and David Terrell, 2 highly touted wide receivers. And so I use that anecdote to illustrate that the traits for Shedeur Stewart are too fascinating to overlook that he's going to go very, very high. On the offensive side of the ball, Matthew Golden, who was exceptional for Texas this year, came on really strong, played his best when it mattered. He was great against Ohio State. He was great in both playoff games for Texas, all 3 playoff games for Texas, I should say, in the college football playoff. A player who, this guy can go. He ran a 4.29 40, and, speed is something that regardless of whether you're doing it at high school, college, or pro level, it travels. You run 4.29 and 191 pounds. That's impressive. Not saying that Xavier Worthy at 4.21 last year was less impressive, but 165 pounders running 4.21 versus 191 pounders running 4.29. Like, I think you can make a case that each of those is comparably impressive.
Let's go a little bit farther down the draft board. Will Howard and the performance at the combine. As I watched that field, I mean, look, I watched him play from the time he was at Kansas State, certainly last year at Ohio State. I don't think that he is a gifted, polished passer, but I know he's way better than that. And it was so off that it was almost something that I was like, nah, that's one of those things. I don't know exactly what happened, but it's not that. What did others that you've talked to make of that? Because I think there was a little bit of a sentiment of, here's a guy who could really be a solid backup for you. Here's a guy, if things go well, maybe in a few years, he might be your quarterback. He's big, he's strong, he's a good leader, he's a good guy.
Yep.
I almost dismiss something like that because I've seen him play. But that was wild. That was a tough day. It was a tough day for a guy who I think is a good player.
It was, and people get mad over players like Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders opting against throwing at the combine, and it's for that exact reason. Those guys are more gifted throwers than Will, to be clear. They're going to go much higher in the draft than Will, to be clear. But if you have a bad day like that, as much as college football fans know the portfolio of both Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, there are some who are kind of catching up in this process, and their first impression might be a guy throwing the ball 5 yards over the receivers' heads or missing the mark by a significant margin, saying to themselves, you're telling me this guy is going to go in the first round? So I have maintained an early day 3 grade on Will throughout the process. And there are some intangibles that I think are going to be very enticing to NFL teams that you alluded to. Rece is a very good athlete. We saw more of that at Kansas State than Ohio State because while they had obviously good players at Kansas State, they didn't have Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins in the backfield at the same time. So they allowed those 2 guys to do much of the heavy lifting. This is sort of the fundamental, to me, evaluation a team has to make on Will. Is we all know the brilliance of Chip Kelly last season at Ohio State. There's a reason why he's now making gobbles of money to be the Raiders offensive coordinator, is that when the puzzle was solved for Will, he put the ball where he needed to put the ball, right? When it wasn't solved, and when you had to ad-lib or you kind of had to figure it out post-snap, how did it look? And so for me, I think, and not that one game defines a season, but that would be the second Oregon game is when the puzzle is solved versus the Michigan game at the end of the season when the puzzle was not solved. And it looks dramatically different. I say early day 3 with one caveat, which is that last year, I thought Spencer Rattler was going to go somewhere second or third round just because he was that 7th quarterback in the class. And you just sort of figure, natural forces drive the quarterbacks up. He had to wait 100 plus picks. He goes in the 5th round of the Saints. So I say early day 3 for Will Howard, but if any of those guys get pushed down a little bit, I shouldn't be totally surprised just because of what we saw 1 year ago in Detroit.
If I'd been Will Howard, every time I missed one of those throws at the combine, I would have turned around and said, see, Jeremiah Smith catches that every time.
Heavy pressure, Howard delivers downfield, and Smith, he's got it! Jeremiah Smith!
It's probably true, by the way. But you know what, though? You cannot discount the competitiveness of those Ohio State kids who, I don't think anybody would have begrudged them if they just opted against doing everything. And some of them did, right? Emeka Egbuka was not participating in the combine. But how about his teammate Donovan Jackson, who Mel Kiper, I think, has accurately coined him as the MVP of that team this past year. A touch of hyperbole, perhaps. There's some Jeremiah Smith believers, and Lathan Ransom was excellent, and those 2 edges up front were great. They had a lot of talent there at Ohio State. But I'm not sure it looks that good if they don't have Donovan Jackson kicking out to left tackle following Josh Simmons' patella tear. And Donovan, who I don't think has a whole lot to prove, like to me, that looks like a ready-made starter and guard in the NFL, was out there doing the positional drills. He's getting his thigh taped up or wrapped up in between reps and just keep going. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I had made it back to Connecticut at that point. I wanted to fly back to Indy somehow and just get off the field. Like, there's so little to gain at this point, other than just reminding us of how tough and truthfully selfless he is. I thought it was a selfless gesture to kick out the left tackle this past year when he could have said to the staff, listen, I'm going to be maybe a first-round pick if I stay in guard. I'm an All-American player here. I got to think about my future. Instead, he thought about the team, and Ohio State goes on to win the championship.
Let's rewind back to quarterbacks, because quarterbacks are the drivers of our billion-dollar industry here, Field.
Yeah.
So I'm always cautious framing a question like this because it is really not rooted in anything other than sentiment, right? There's no empirical evidence that shows Shedeur Sanders is probably in a little bit of a decline in the sort of draft cycle right now. But there was some buzz that wasn't positive about his interviews. Take that for what it is. We've heard a lot about those interviews over the years. They usually don't amount to much. And it feels like there's a little separation from Cam Ward now, which I don't think is like particularly surprising when you look at their skill sets. But do you think that there is separation between Cam and Shedeur, and there could be a gap between where Cam goes and Shedeur does? And could someone usurp Shedeur, and could there be a new QB2 here? Jackson Dart would be the most viable suspect for that.
Yeah, you got the right principles in place here. I'll say, like, on the interview thing, just to address that, like, my stance has always been like, I know enough people that are involved in enough of these interviews that,
and you've been in them, right?
Yeah. I as a young scouting assistant setting up the room, to be clear, I was like making sure the popcorn was lined in the proper fashion and things of that nature, not asking any questions or even involved. So if I hear it myself, then I am definitely going to, then I give it some credence, right? I haven't yet heard anything that makes me feel as though the interviews went poorly with Shedeur Sanders. I think that more so than anything, both of these kids have checked off a lot of the boxes of what you saw on tape, which is sort of like tape versus interviews, two different things, but
sure.
Toughness, reliability. There are some people that I think are perturbed by the success that the Sanders family has had, because success breeds envy. Shedeur Sanders also, I'll say this for him, it's a lot of spotlight to handle at a young age. And, I've seen a lot of success. I haven't seen much in the way of like negative off-field behavior, right? So like I actually find myself largely impressed with the mettle of Shedeur. What I will say, though, is, and you're right, we are in the information gathering business, is I feel leaving Indianapolis, and I don't believe anything is dealt with unanimously in the draft, that the majority of people that I spoke with felt as though it's not Cam Ward versus Shedeur Sanders. It's Cam Ward, and there's a second cut, and that's Shedeur Sanders, right? That being said, if the Cleveland Browns and the New York Giants don't get their hands on Cam Ward, Shedeur Sanders could go second or third overall. Like, I am totally not dismissing that possibility. The last thing I'll say about this, to address the Jackson Dart part. Yeah, I think Jackson's going to have a chance to creep into the first round.
Interesting.
And Jackson had obviously a very, very productive career at Ole Miss. He broke Eli Manning's school record for passing yards. Has a lot of experience, which is kind of in vogue right now after both Jaden Daniels and Bo Nix starred as rookies last year with 5 full years of college starting experience. So I'm very mindful of that stuff, right? That being said, I still think Jackson gets into round 1. Some of my colleagues that are doing their mock drafts as well right now are a bit more hesitant or skeptical of that. One thing that I think will inform that reality is what happens in this quarterback cycle in free agency. Sam Darnold's going to go somewhere. Once he does, cross that team off. If he goes to the Raiders no longer in the quarterback market. If he goes to the Titans no longer in the quarterback market. Not the Jets. I should cross them off. He obviously would not go back to New York. But you guys get the point. Wherever he lands, throw that team out of the quarterback basket. So once that dust has settled, like if we see a couple of teams make 1-year investments, if Pittsburgh re-signs Justin Fields or Russell Wilson for 1 year at modest money, you can't tell me that they're still not thinking about a quarterback at pick number 21, which is where I had Jackson in my most recent mock draft, which is close to a month old now. But I still feel like that is a reasonable expectation of where he could get drafted.
I've got one last question for you. Were you able to get coffee without incident in Indianapolis?
Well, Pete and I did have a near kerfuffle, but we were able to settle our differences. Pete and I.
It was a good time to take advantage of Field. He's down. He's got a bad wing, so I know when to pounce.
And so Pete and I, obviously, I would say regarded in most circles within ESPN as two of the more, I think. We just love chaos and we love confrontation. So it comes as no surprise that Pete and I had our incident, but we ended up settling it. And I'm thankful for that because for those who say there's no such, all news or all press is good press, I'm not always the same subscriber to that notion.
Rece, just so you know, we're both massholes, so we would have our fight at Dunkin' Donuts. Okay?
That's right.
I just want to be clear about that. Unequivocal.
Yeah.
In there. So, Field, I'm going to close with this. I saw you and our friend Laura Rutledge dining at St. Elmo's, the iconic Indianapolis establishment. Overrated or underrated?
I think properly rated.
All right, fair.
And I'd say here's the reason why. I only go there once a year, basically. It's at the Combine. And so you have the cocktail sauce, and every year you think you've mastered it, right? It's like you're not going to be afraid when you jump on a roller coaster, and then you get on the roller coaster and you're screaming for 8 minutes, right? I'm sitting there and I'm like, I got this. I'm going to be completely unbothered, nonplussed by this cocktail sauce. And then you have one and you're like, I almost wish I had been sick when I got here because I would no longer be sick now. I've got 2 young children, as I know you both know. I would say that our culinary menu has just sort of has regressed over the past few years. A lot of we're more function over fashion these days as it pertains to what we eat in the Yates household. So I do enjoy a good night out, and so a steak is always welcomed as far as I'm concerned.
So you don't have one of those coordinator diner menus? You got a little like wristband on your dining play sheet?
Yeah. The dining, it's macaroni and cheese, chicken nuggets, or I don't even know what else, or grilled cheese maybe.
Are you looking in our cabinets here?
Yes. The Thamel household looks much like the Yates household these days.
The St. Elmo's cocktail sauce there. I have a photograph of Jay Williams, who was unfamiliar with it, and big trip, giant bite, and the vein on his head is protruding, and he got angry with me. He said I didn't properly warn him of what was to come. I love that even when the horseradish overwhelms you, I enjoy that. I really drink very little. I never and will not ever do any type of drug. So like horseradish and wasabi rush, that's kind of it for me. When I get those two and they kind of get to me, I'm good.
That might be the most Rece Davis thing I've ever heard, by the way. He drinks a glass of whole milk before bed every night and watches Perry Mason. These are the things when you do a podcast with a guy for 3 years, you learn.
You should have seen the case that Perry solved last night aboard a ship. I mean, there was some convoluted malfeasance dating back to some earlier things in Chicago that put some twists and turns in the whole plot. But he and Paul Drake got things sorted out with the help of Della Street. I don't like the new Perry. I don't like the new Perry Mason as much. The one that Max, it's dark, and that's not what I'm there for. I'm there to figure out a little whodunit. It's black and white. If you fall asleep watching it, who cares? No big deal. That's what I'm after with Perry Mason. I'm not for some, dark, awful, emotionally tortured people. People just, somebody made an error in judgment. They whacked somebody and Perry figures it out and sends them off to jail. That's what I'm there for.
I'm thinking about maybe I need to change my ways. I mean, Rece hasn't aged a day, so I'm thinking maybe I need to adopt this ritual pre-bed: a glass of whole milk and some Perry Mason. I could be convinced that this is a way to keep yourself looking a certain way.
That's it. Field, thanks a lot, man. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Sounds good, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Field Yates, I would say rising star, but he's already a star. Does an unbelievable job in getting things in order before the NFL draft starts in Green Bay this time. Pete, before we wrap here, I teased it right at the top of the pod. Yeah. There is some potential movement on the fake injury issue, and Basically, it would involve taking timeouts away from teams that have to have players attended to after the ball has been spotted. As I've read this, I'm sure there are loopholes and circumstances that you haven't thought of yet. I think this is probably an effective way to deal with it, because I have been steadfastly against making the officials arbiters of medical situations. I don't like that, because, like, for instance, I had a game last fall in which it certainly looked as if a guy flopped. It looked for all the world like it. Yet, as I looked down at him lying on the ground, his breathing appeared to be very rapid and somewhat labored. Okay, now, maybe that was still a flop and he was just tired. But my point is, you don't know, and asking the official to know is too much. But if you sort of make a uniform thing across the board that, okay, this is going to cost you a timeout or a 5-yard penalty, no matter the circumstance, it doesn't leave that nebulous area for an official to determine whether the injury or the issue is real. And also, as I read through this has not been approved yet, is my understanding, but as I read through this, it would also still, you wouldn't be charged a timeout if an official saw someone, hey, 24 needs to get off the field here. That wouldn't cost you a timeout. What's your initial reaction to this?
I've just always wondered why, after the injured player leaves the field, they couldn't just start the clock again.
Mm-hmm.
To me, like, forget the putting the official in a bad place, empathetic to that. Forget all of the different things. Like, if you can, if as an offense you're trying to drain the clock, and as a defense you're trying to, like, I think that would solve at least like half of the issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you are trying to intentionally stop the clock, you can give someone the option to restart it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So say an offensive player fakes the injury because of whatever happens. You say to the defensive coach, do you want to restart the clock or stop it? And then switch back and forth. I just don't know why. Is that logic crazy to you?
Well, no, not at all. But I think it's just not always about saving time. Sometimes it's about changing the tempo of the game, slowing teams down, in the middle of the game,
giving
in
a
terms
break.
of giving a break, getting a substitution in, whatever it might be. Yeah, some guy you got locked. And there's less of that in college football than there was 10, 12 years ago, where teams were just running plays as fast as they could. And defenses were getting caught in tough personnel groupings and they couldn't substitute. That was, there's far less of that than there used to be. But there are still, coaches who it has appeared that they've wanted to change things. I mean, we've seen guys line up at running back and, standing there, and all of a sudden they just, hit the ground and kind of stop things. And and you wonder why. Maybe they just want some more time for communication or whatever. But I think doing something like this seems, on the surface, at least, first glance, first read through, if it were to get approved, to be reasonable. It was a part of me initially that didn't like taking the timeouts for this. And I still stand by the fact that as it pertains to fake injuries, it can be stopped immediately by the coaches. Don't do it. Just simply don't do it. Don't allow it. Don't permit it on your team. And that puts a stop to it. That is the most effective way to stop it. And I wish that would be the way that it does get stopped. But, if it's that old thing. It's not that coaches just want to do it. They're afraid the other guy's going to do it. And he's doing it, so I've got to do it. And while that's not true, it's like the old thing that, you'll say to Teddy Thamel someday, just because, little Johnny down there decided to go, see if he could, jump off that bridge. You're not going to do it. And, that age-old piece of wisdom certainly applies. But if you're going to do something that brings about some type of uniform penalty, I guess maybe this is as reasonable a way to go as any.
And I think that's totally fair, and I do think they're stigmatizing this behavior is going to be a little bit of a course correction too, right? Like, Because coaches now will be criticized for it. And if there's punitive things, and look, those timeouts are precious. That's why they're doing this stuff generally in the first place. And also if it's a situation where the timeout isn't as valuable, it may incentivize it too.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, look, if there's a gray area, they will find it. Yes. All right, Pete, you and I are going to limit our subscriptions at some point, maybe later on during the off season, but never limit your subscription to the College GameDay Podcast. You can subscribe, never miss a single episode. We'll continue to be on weekly, probably a couple more here and there as the NCAA Tournament comes around. Thanks for listening. We hope you will listen to every episode wherever you prefer to get your podcast.